Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we're going to make a set of color block cards, and here are some of the supplies we're going to use. Now, I made a template for this kind of in my own unique way, which basically means making mistakes and then slapping it together, which I will put measurements and a photo of it on my blog, so you can copy that down. We're going to use some peg stamps by our sponsor, Rubber Stamp Tapestry. You can find them online at pegstamps.com, and make sure you check out this week's coupon code so you can save 10% on your order. I also have their unmounted stamps too. You're going to want some inexpensive cardstock that you can practice doing some inky backgrounds, and you want to cut that into quarters so that you will have, 4 different pieces to ink up differently, because that's what we're going to need. And you're also going to want to cut 2 pieces of heavyweight cardstock in half and fold them in half to make your card bases. I also went ahead and made 4 envelopes out of some pretty aqua colored pattern paper that I had left over, and I saved the scraps just in case I made a mistake with any of my inking and I needed to get a couple extra color blocked pieces. So, if you don't end up using it for this, you can always use it for something else. This is a great project for getting to know your distress inks or distress oxide inks. So basically what I did was I made 4 groupings of colors. So I went with a green group, an orangey yellow gray group, a pink group, and a purpley blue group. And now I'm going to take one of my panels of paper and I am going to start inking it up. So each of my panels of paper will be showcasing a different color group. Because this tends to be repetitive, I have really sped up this for backgrounds getting inked. So here I just direct to paper, put my 3 shades from the kind of green color family, and now I'm using a sponge blender to kind of just spread that ink around because it's very, it's kind of greasy and it just kind of sits at the top of the paper. And now I am drying it with the heat tool. So now I'm just kind of spraying my paper and just dipping the cardstock into it. And what this did was actually it just lightened everything. When you oxidize the entire thing by adding water, it really just gives you a muted look, and it's not really that interesting. But I wanted to show you that because that is not my favorite technique. I almost look at that as an accident, but that's, if you do this and you wet the entire paper, that's what you're going to get, this very chalk finish type look with it's very muted. So then I went over with some more color and blended it out a little bit just so there weren't greasy spots, and I decided to put a little spray ink on my paper and just kind of sop that up because the colors got really muted, like I mentioned, because I wet the whole thing. And now I'm putting on some golden shimmery spray and some other blue shimmery spray ink that I have, and basically just trying to salvage this piece. The thing I find with mixed media is if you feel like you've ruined it, just go a little deeper, add a few more layers, and worst comes to worst, you've wasted a little bit of media and a scrap of paper, but you can usually pull it back. But that's why I wanted to keep this in its entirety, even though I sped it up, because you do get some bummers, and sometimes your paper doesn't come out good until you've done a few layers. But hopefully also to help you avoid that if you don't want that look. So finally, after adding another layer and putting on some little speckles of water, I got the look I was going for. When you're going for 4 distinct backgrounds or multiple distinct color families of backgrounds, it's important that you clean your work surface up between inking, or you're going to end up with some mud. So that's what I was doing there with the rag. So here on this surface, I am doing shades of yellow and orange. And again, I am spreading that ink around so it's covering the entire surface of the paper. And this time I'm just going to give it a little dry, and I'm going to give it some big speckles of water. And this is my favorite effect with the Distress Oxides. You can see how quickly it reveals that oxidization, but you can actually do this and get a very similar look with regular distress inks as well. So go ahead and give that a try. And of course, these color block cards can be made with paper scraps or backgrounds you've already made. If you do have ink left over on your work surface, don't be shy. You can always spray that with water and scoop it up with that same color family cardstock. And unless the cardstock's already perfect and you don't want to add any texture, I just want to let you know that. So starting off the exact same way here, putting on 3 shades of pink and smearing the ink together, and then giving it some more red because I'm like, oh, this pink is just kind of, it didn't have the contrast that I wanted, so I grabbed some candied apple and threw that on top. Now I grabbed the wrong sprayer and it ended up putting a huge amount there, so then I went with my garden sprayer, which gives me bigger pieces and one on top. And now I'm making some puddles to drag my cardstock through, like I mentioned before, and then I kind of shake it and let it drip around, and I find that just gives me an interesting look. And you can see anywhere there was a lot of water, that's where I get that lighter pigment coming to the surface and giving the Distress Oxides their kind of classic look. So here I was using some pink ink that had a little shimmer in it because I do like that look on a card, especially in person. When you hold it up, it just looks really cool, even if it doesn't show on video as well. And I'm giving it another dry with a heat tool to see how it really looks once it's dry. The thing that I noticed about the kind of pink shades in Distress Oxide, once you add water to them, they almost go to about the same color. You lose a lot of that distinction. So if you are collecting the ink pads one by one and you're kind of, building your collection that way, the pinks can look very samey. That's the coral and the worn lipstick. And, there was another, the picked raspberries. They do kind of oxidize out to a very similar color, but that's how that one turned out. And finally, we're going to work on the purple card, and for that I used both of the purples and the Salty Ocean, because I thought that blue kind of would make a better purple than some of the others and not darken it too much. But again, basically starting with the same technique of covering the cardstock with a thin layer of the ink, kind of smushing it down and then spreading it out, then putting some big droplets. And I didn't even dry it before blotting, and I actually like the effect of that better. I got a much more strong contrast there. And here you can see the four backgrounds as they stand at this point, and I thought that they needed a little something. I wanted a little more shimmer on them. Sometimes when you're using the Distress Oxides and you do shimmer spray, the whatever rises up in the oxidization kind of dulls out the shimmer spray. So I had these old pads of Mica Magic ink, and it's basically like a very weak metallic ink, and I didn't really like them that much, but when I was decluttering my craft room, I just couldn't throw them away. I thought they might be useful, and they're perfect for this because I can go over with that and not really obscure the Distress Oxide design and pattern that I've made, but I can add that subtle shimmer here and there and kind of bring out some of the gloss, and just I've really just liked the effect of it. So as you can see, I did kind of spread it around with my fingers after smushing the ink pad down, just to kind of get a little bit of color here and there. And then finally I decided I wanted a little bit more of a shimmer, so I used a big fluffy paintbrush and some micro Pearl-Ex, which is just like a clear mica powder, and dusted that on top just to bring out a little bit more shine. That Pearl-Ex powder is going to stick to any pigment ink, so you can use whatever metallic ink you have. If you don't have any, you could just use clear Versamark ink, and that would work just as well. So use what you have. There's really, you really don't have to be too fussy about it. Now we're going to do some stamping, and I'm going to start off with Peacock Feathers Distress Oxide ink and the small mason jar stamp from the stamp set I showed you earlier. And I have cut some watercolor paper, just a scrap I had, to one of the sizes from my Colorblocked template. And I am stamping I'm doing these all at once because, as you know, it only takes a little extra time to make a batch of cards than it does just to make one card. So I'm just, deciding to make more use of my time here, make better use of my time. Now I'm using a water brush with, just a fine tip and water, and I am spreading out the ink from my stamped image just to give it a little bit of quick and easy watercoloring. Now I'm using the ink pad Candied Apple with the large poppy from the Watercolor Garden set, and I am stamping that over each of the vases. Now I'm using regular old watercolor paper, so it's kind of bumpy, so you can see that I'm not getting a very solid impression, but that's fine because I can go right in with that same water brush and I can add water to it, and it's going to make it look even more like a watercolor and kind of spread that ink around. Now to clean your water brush between colors, all you need to do is squeeze out a little water and wipe it onto a scrap of paper, and you're all ready to start with the next color. Up next we have Fossilized Amber in this trio of flowers, and remember, when you're working with peg stamps or really any stamping, start with your biggest item and then work smaller and smaller and smaller, and it just makes it easier to fit everything in your composition. Now I'm using Lucky Clover ink and this sprig of leaves to add some more filler into the vase. And I find that if you have like something that's kind of not a really tightly packed design, you can go in, sneak it around, and actually work with a larger image if it is sparse like these leaves are. I started off just by putting it in once to see how that looks, and then I realized that I could really add a lot of kind of depth and weight and fullness with this image, so I went ahead and stamped it again, letting it go off the little panels in spots, because I feel like it just gives it a nice fullness that would be hard to achieve otherwise. Next, I have Seedless Preserves, which is a really pretty purple, and this little bunch of grapes, it looks like. It's some sort of little berry, and that's going to go into the composition. It's going to be nice because it gives it a little pop of color, and it also is a different shape. So I'm able to repeat colors that I used in my background pieces for the color blocking and add it into my, focal point image. I think it looks great. Now I'm using picked raspberry and this tiny poppy from Petite Poppies, and when I have a tiny thing like this, I love to repeat it. So I'm stamping that 3 times on each of these panels. Now every panel is done in the same way, but I'm going to put the little elements where I want them, however it's going to fit with that composition the best. So don't feel like you have to stamp exactly the way that I am. You need to look at what you're stamping and see what's going to improve and add interest to your specific composition. Now with peeled paint, I've got another sprig of leaves. This one's a little bit smaller and more dense, and I'm just going to stamp this everywhere I can. Any place I feel like I want to add a little bulk. Okay, think of it kind of like putting baby's breath in a floral arrangement. It's adding a little bit of bulk and interest, but it's not really overshadowing anything else. And this would be kind of one of my kind of tinier, more petite patterns that I like to use at the end. I decided that the vases needed a little bit of reflection or shadow underneath, so I pressed my acrylic block to the ink pad, and I'm just adding a little bit of color within the vase and also underneath on the table. When you have colored glass and the light shining through, you generally get a little bit of not only shadow but also refracted light on the table, and it just has a really pretty look, and it also will ground my image. I also grabbed some yellow ink in the same fashion and added it to the center of my flowers. Now I'm using Seedless Preserves to add a frame on each of my images, and I actually took the applicator and stamped it off on the top of my ink pad cover because I didn't want to have too much on there. I just wanted a very soft, gentle rouging of the edges of each of the panels here. Now if I need to pick up more ink, I'm just going to lift that up from the lid rather than from the juicy pad. That way I don't end up getting too much ink and ruining my whole composition. So do that for each of those panels. Using the measurements I wrote on my template as a guide, I cut out the inked backgrounds to fit the little boxes in my color block template. And I had some scraps left over, so I thought that would be a great opportunity to stamp my sentiments. I'm using archival ink because I know that will dry on top of this multimedia surface, whereas other inks may just smear later on. So you want to make sure you're going to use an ink that will dry. And you also are going to want to heat set it before you go and trim it out because you could smear it even if it is a waterproof ink. So what I like to do is stamp things a few times. That way, if it doesn't turn out all right, I have a few options when I am card making. I'm using gold mini brads to attach the sentiments to the box in my color box template that's going to be on the upper right hand side of the card or corner of the card. This is the only embellishment that I'm using, these little gold brads, but I think it makes a nice subtle statement and I really like the way it looks. And you want to do this before you start gluing your card together. That way you can hide the legs of the brad between your card and the color block layer. Now it's the fun part. You get to assemble the cards. You've done all the work, now it's the play. So we're just going to use some double-sided tape to adhere everything down. And as you can see, I'm organized by stacking up all of the pre-cut pieces on top of my template so I can see exactly how it's going to go down. And basically what I'm trying to do is keep about a 1/8 inch border between all of the elements as well as the side of the card. You can rearrange a little bit, you can make a narrower border, you can trim little bits off if you need to with some scissors as you're building. Don't be worried, just have fun. Now like I mentioned before, this would be a great way to use up some scraps. If you had some like pattern paper that you absolutely loved and hated to waste a sliver of, this is a great way to use it up. It's also a great way to use up backgrounds you may have made in the past and just didn't have a use for. So keep this filed away. You can copy the template off of my website if you want to. I'll have a link in the video description. And otherwise I think there's probably even dies to be able to do this easier. I don't have any dies, but they used to have little templates back in the day when we scrapbooked to do scrapbook layouts and cards with. So maybe you have some of those in your stash as well. I really want to thank you so much for hanging out today. I do hope you give this a try, and if you have any questions on either the stamping techniques or the background techniques, please leave them in the video description. I want to thank our sponsor, Rubber Stamp Tapestry, for sponsoring today and making these tutorials possible. You can find them online at pegstamps.com, and make sure you use the coupon code to save 10% off your order if you are going to be placing an order. They also have a mailing list where they offer exclusive deals on their peg stamps and unmounted stamp sets. So if you are a fan, make sure you join so you can get the best deals possible. I guess that's all I have for today. Here you can see the card completely done. It's got a nice little shimmer to it when you tip it to the light, and I'll show you all the cards together because I went ahead and assembled them all. And there are the envelopes I made ahead of time. I didn't end up using any of the scraps, so I'll save that for something else. But here you can see the variety of cards I made. They're all pretty much the same, except they have different sentiments, which are really handy to have on hand when you need that special card, or if you do craft fairs and you want to make up a batch to sell. Thanks again so much for watching. Please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you like this channel. Until next time, happy crafting!